Hello, and welcome to the Aurora podcast, where we discuss topics that are used to advance our understanding of today's world. Today, I'm joined with Coleton McCoy, and will be interviewing Chris Hull. Chris, would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about what you're studying?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast, Ben, and Colton. So a little bit about my background. I am currently doing a PhD in energy and power at Oxford University, and my specific my thesis is on the electrification of transport in developing contexts, specifically on the electrification of paratransit in sub-Saharan Africa, which I'll get to more about what that is later. But my background before this PhD was I did a degree in economics at Stanford, as well as a master's degree in management science and engineering, also at Stanford in the energy and environment track, both of which had a lot of sort of data science focuses and then obviously economics focus. And so I'm in the engineering department here at Oxford. And so what that's allowed me to do, this transition between economics and engineering and sort of the combination between the two, is take more of a holistic view and a more of honestly more of a practical view at the solutions that I and the projects that I'm involved in working on in the energy and power group. It's allowed me to take a little bit more of a practical view on their implementation because obviously all of the sort of problems we're looking at with transportation, there's sort of an economic component and an engineering component, and so that's sort of my interest is sort of combining these two to implement practical solutions. And so the motivation for what I'm researching really boils down to decarbonization and to offsetting carbon emissions from transport, which is one of the largest carbon emitting sectors in the world. And so, obviously, reducing carbon emissions is really important for combating global warming, which is the issue caused by too many greenhouse gases, carbon being the most prolific among them, being released into the atmosphere, and then trapping heat release from the Earth, which results in the Earth warming up, which has probably most people are familiar with that this is not a good thing,
Yeah,
and sort of imminently needs to be dealt with. And so in that spirit, the solutions that I'm trying to look at in developing contexts are sort of combining the like trying to come up with cost effective things that can help places where there isn't the technology or capital to develop solutions that help them not emit carbon in the first place, whilst also um, providing sort of an economic technological advance. Because the tricky thing in developing contexts is yes, you want to avoid carbon emissions, but at the same time, you don't want to constrict development. You don't want people in poor countries to remain in poverty. Like the main goal is to lift people out of poverty. So, for example, a lot of my research is in South Africa, where more than 80% of the country sort of lives in poverty, and all throughout sub-Saharan Africa that like this is the case. Like there's just the vast majority of people sort of live hand to mouth, and solutions like any sort of technological solution needs to kind of be aware of this. At the same time, we have this global issue of climate change and global warming, so we need to balance those two things. And so my specific area of focus within transportation in developing context, is I'm looking at what's called paratransit, which is something I mentioned before. And paratransit is it's a type of public transport. So what paratransit means specifically is informal, unscheduled, demand-driven, uh, privately owned public transport, which
hmm,
is a little bit confusing. But in practice, it makes a lot of sense. It's basically what it means is there are these taxis that sort of run around cities in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you are someone that takes them all the time, you go to a place where you know that they go and you know where it's going. So you go to the place where you know it'll pick people up. You know which taxi to take because you've been doing it for your whole life, and you get it and you go to the right area. And sometimes like they'll go to these taxi ranks where stops and locations are labeled, but it's a very informal system. Is on. So if you Google a picture of minibus taxi rank in Johannesburg, for example, or minibus taxi in Johannesburg. It's chaotic. It's absolutely chaos. But people get where they're going. It's very effective. And this is the case uh, in cities all over sub-Saharan Africa, in Lagos, in Dar es Salaam, in Johannesburg, Cape Town, etc. And so this provides paratransit. Basically, it also, the vehicle classes within paratransit consist of mainly minibus taxis. So picture a 14-seater, 16-seater minibus taxi, maybe like a Toyota Hiace, if you're familiar with that. So it carries 14 to 16 people. There's also these bikes, motorbikes. So they have different names in some places, like Boda Boda. But the minibus taxi is the most common one, and they provide sort of upwards of 70 to 80% of public transport throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Um, there aren't super precise estimates, but somewhere between sort of two-thirds and 80%. And again, it's privately owned, so a lot of times there will be sort of like a minibus taxi owner who owns like a fleet of taxis and then rents it out to drivers. There's a bunch of different sort of business models there, but the government doesn't own it, is basically the upshot there. And so since it's such a ubiquitous mode of transport throughout the region, uh, basically a lot of impact can be had by focusing on this sector, which is the motivation for my work in my PhD. And the work is to decarbonize them and is to electrify them. So currently, all of these minibus taxis or paratransit, I'll just call them minibus taxis because that's probably just a more familiar term. Um, they all run on petrol or diesel, which obviously is a fossil fuel. So petrol is what it's called there. I guess that's like petroleum or gasoline. You would know it as gasoline in the US. So gasoline or diesel. Um, and when you burn something like gasoline or diesel, it releases carbon into the atmosphere, right? So like there's a little combustion reaction that goes on in the engines of these vehicles, and that combustion reaction releases carbon into the atmosphere, and and it also releases air pollutants into the air. So things like nitrous oxide and some sulfurous emissions that cause health hazards in cities. And so if you have a lot of these vehicles, I mean, most people are familiar with smog due to car transportation, or heavy amount of car transportation in cities, and so that's that's also an issue. These taxis tend to be quite inefficient, and so there are immediate health hazards, as well as the sort of climate issue. And so converting these fleets of taxis, of which there are many across sub-Saharan Africa, converting them to electric would immediately do away with the local air pollution problem. There wouldn't be the nitrous oxide emissions or the tailpipe emissions, basically, because there is no tailpipe on an electric vehicle. And then as well as using electricity as power or as fuel, basically could vastly reduce the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions of these vehicles, instead of using diesel or petroleum slash gasoline, whatever you want to call it. Um, Now that depends on the carbon intensity of the grid from which it is drawing electricity. So if you think about, I own a minibus taxi, I plug it in at night here to charge. Well, it's the electricity's got to come from somewhere. So if a bunch of coal plants or other fossil fuels like coal-fired plants or gas-fired plants are burning to produce that electricity, then the extra electrical demand from these minibus taxis is increasing the demand for coal, and then that's increasing the greenhouse gases that go into the air, the carbon emissions that go into the air. But if the grid is a little bit more powered by renewables, or maybe like natural gas or something that is less carbon intensive, then if you calculate the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions of the vehicles, it drastically reduces when you convert them to electric, and then over time you can sort of aim towards a net zero goal, with an increasingly carbon sorry with a decreasingly carbon intensive grid, which pretty much most countries around the world have some sort of goal. If you're familiar with like the Paris Accords, the Paris Agreement in 2015, or like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, like it's pretty common for countries to have a goal of reaching towards net zero by like 2050 or something, and then the world is sort of generally heading in this sort of direction of net zero. So the idea is that by electrifying transport, decarbonization is happening alongside it, And then also since um, decarbonized sources of electricity tend to be cheaper than in most places than fossil fuels, that in fact fuel for transport becomes cheaper as well. So that in and of itself can reduce the lifetime operating cost of these vehicles, which is useful for the people who are driving the vehicles, which is oftentimes these sort of people in poverty-stricken locations in sub-Saharan Africa that we're looking at. So that sort of harkens back to what I was saying earlier about combining the economic and engineering solution. And so the question is how to convert these vehicle fleets or these paratransit vehicle fleets to electric. And there's a couple possible routes to do it. So one of them is you could import electric minibuses, but there's not really global supply chains for that yet. And also shipping these buses doesn't seem like a very sustainable solution. Um, and it also is very expensive. So my PhD focuses on creating a retrofit conversion, an electric vehicle retrofit conversion, creating an electric vehicle retrofit for these minibus taxis, which basically means just taking out the internal combustion engine and sort of the associated bits with that, and replacing it with a battery and a motor and the associated electronics and bits with that. And that would be a much cheaper and quicker way to electrify these buses potentially than importing complete new vehicles. As well as it doesn't require you to throw away basically the old um, fossil fuel powered vehicle like chassis and everything. So like if you imported a bunch of new vehicles, what are you going to do with the old ones? But if you retrofit them, it just seems like a more sustainable solution on the whole. And then as well as you build up the local capacity to work with electric vehicles and you build up skilled labor in these areas that you're trying to empower economically. And so it's very beneficial for there to be local skilled labor in terms of the country's like local skilled labor force economic empowerment to be able to be able to handle the electrified transition. Whereas if you imported a bunch of vehicles and say they break down, then nobody in the local area knows how to come out and fix it, sort of thing. Um, and yeah, and then the flip side to the vehicle side is the charging infrastructure side, since that's also very expensive and you can't actually just plug a vehicle into your wall socket. You need like a specific type of charger. Um, and so that's sort of I'm a year into my PhD. I'm starting my second year. It'll be 3 or 4 years long, and so that's sort of the next thing that we're looking at is you can develop simulations based on vehicle GPS tracking data to optimize the placement of charging infrastructure because it is very expensive, and you want to be kind of judicious with where you place it, and you want to optimize also the type of charger that you're placing and like what vehicle it's for and everything. So being very careful about planning that will help with and running simulations to show that what you've done is optimal and that it can charge a fleet of X number of vehicles will help with convincing city planners, municipalities, stakeholders, whatever, that this is a good idea. And because it is something, the electrifying fleets is something that we know, we being people in my group and people I've working on project with, we know that local governments and fleet planners in sub-Saharan Africa are interested in because they've approached us and we've worked with them. But oftentimes there are certain unanswered questions, such as the ones with the charging infrastructure, that need to be looked into before you can commit to a transition. And so our research aims to supply those answers so that in practice people can go ahead and make this leap, as well as the retrofit thing that I mentioned earlier, so that they have a way to not only address the infrastructure side but also the vehicle side. So yeah, I guess that in a nutshell is the focus, the motivation and focus for my research.
Have you done any research on how synthetic fuels can help aid in getting to carbon zero?
So I used to work for a like a basically a hydrogen startup, I guess you would call it. So when you say synthetic fuels, are you referring to more like biofuels?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't done any research into biofuels specifically. I've done a little bit of research into hydrogen, like hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which I think have applications for larger vehicles and also shipping. But there are issues with hydrogen transportation and supply chains because it's so hard to store. so for example, just the other year, actually in Santa Clara in the Bay Area, there was a hydrogen fuel cell station that exploded. I think nobody was hurt, but basically it's just incredibly hard to store. But also it's very energy dense because it is a liquid fuel, whereas an electric vehicle powered by a lithium ion battery, which is currently like usually, or lithium ion phosphate or whatever, it's not as energy dense. Basically, the batteries aren't. So as a liquid fuel. And so when you get to larger and larger vehicles, the size of the battery needs to scale up so much that it's just not efficient. Like they can't go very far and they need to charge a lot. So this is why you don't see a lot of large shipping or actually aviation solutions, electric aviation solutions. And they come out with things and planes that can go short distances, and they maybe have solar panels on their wings, which can help. But like the electric equivalent of a Boeing 737 that just kind of is a commercial airliner that takes you everywhere, we're so far away from that just because of battery size issues. And so I think like low carbon fuels, liquid fuels that are energy dense, maybe like hydrogen or something, have a place for potentially larger transportation, or like maybe shipping or aviation. But there are lots of issues with basically transmission of distribution of this fuel. Production is the production of these fuels is sort of an area of high interest in a lot of energy startups. So, for example, I mentioned I used to work for this startup that was it was the thrust of the startup was a hydrogen electrolyzer, basically a cheaper way to produce hydrogen, basically by you pass water through an electrolyzer and it splits the H2O, the water, into hydrogen and oxygen. And if the electrolyzer is powered by renewable electricity because it needs electricity to run, then that's free hydrogen basically. It's zero carbon hydrogen. So there's a lot of solutions coming out around that. Again, it's sort of further away. There's also this sort of competing issue of if there's a lot of fuel station. If you're a government of a country, are you going to invest in electric vehicles or are you going to invest in hydrogen or synthetic fuel vehicles? Because they have two completely different infrastructure needs, and you don't want to double invest. You don't want to invest in all the charging
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure as well as all the fuel cell infrastructure. That doesn't seem super efficient. So yeah, I haven't done a ton of specific research into that, but that's sort of my general take on my general impression of the field.
Sweet.
What would you say is something that like your average Joe, your normal day person could try to start to do to help reach net zero?
Your everyday person, your average Joe. Well, there's a whole lot of things you can do to kind of reduce your carbon footprint, I guess is what they call it these days. And you can like take quizzes online to see like based on your daily habits, like what is your carbon footprint. And oftentimes the greatest thing that contributes to your carbon footprint from those will be like air travel. If you ever do that, if you do it and you take like a couple plane flights a year or something, it'll be like 70% of your carbon footprint, which is crazy. And it's just for like a couple of trips. So like, what are you going to do? And then I think not eating meat or like eating vegan is another one that has sort of a big impact on daily life, and obviously like just like reducing water and energy consumption. But the thing is it's so hard to get people to change en masse like that with behaviors. Like how good of a chance do you think it is that everybody just goes vegan tomorrow? There's
Zero.
that's probably not going to work. Um, so the best thing to do for the average Joe would be to get involved in a solution that makes it both economic and efficient for that, but just like increases the sort of the economic profile and the efficiency of different solutions that push towards decarbonization, and just educating yourself. Really, the big thing is just educating yourself because you'd be surprised about like some very easy things you can do. Of course, like I'm drawing a blank right now, nothing is really jumping to mind, but I'm sure you'd be surprised at like little things in your life that you do that could reduce your energy consumption a lot. That often also like will reduce your energy bill or save you money in some way. Um, yeah, so I think the honestly, I'd say the best thing the average Joe could do would be to just look online, educate yourself, like take one of these quizzes, learn about your habits, and then learn about general things that contribute to a less carbon intensive world.
Would you say you have any like trusted websites, or like, let's say somebody's watching and they want to go do what you're saying, where would you say you direct them?
Okay, so I don't have any specific trusted websites off the top of my head. What I would do is I would go to um, like a university website or like an institution that you can obviously trust, and then they'll almost always have resources. So like the energy department or something of some university that you trust, or ask a teacher at your like school who might know. But also, if you do enough research, which isn't that hard, so say you Google a question and you look through like the top three sources, if they all agree on something, like pretty good bet. You know what I'm saying? And you can talk to your friends about it and use your common sense and see what you say, because a lot of it is, it's common sense. For example, like the vegan thing, like the meat thing, like, okay, yeah, obviously, like you're not going to do that necessarily, but like there are certain things that are like, okay, turning off the lights, whatever, like using less water, or like there will be some habit that you didn't realize used a lot of hot water, but it does, and you'll be like, okay, that obviously is not very efficient. So no, I don't have any trusted sites off the top of my head. I would say, yeah, use kind of a combination of like referrals from trusted sources and your own common sense, and you can find good resources on Google.
Cool.
Nice. So going kind of back to paratransit, which is what you were talking about earlier, are there specific areas where carbon levels are super high where we'd want to introduce those first?
Introduce like solutions for decarbonization,
Yeah,
in terms of areas where paratransit operates.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think um, the my research focuses on South Africa simply because paratransit is so ubiquitous in South Africa. Like it's like 15 million trips a day. But it's honestly, if you look at other countries like Uganda, Nigeria, Tanzania, it's huge there. But so I think where you would probably want to focus your efforts towards first is places where you think that the solutions would be more easily uptaken, if that's a word, more easily accepted, maybe. Which is why we've decided to focus on South Africa, because there's a little bit more infrastructure there than other places in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you can demonstrate proof of concept, then you can attract more investment. So, for example, we've had interest from several outside investors. I don't think I can say who, but basically, if we get a few electric minibuses on the road, we get a charger, a minibus taxi like electric vehicle charger on the route that it's run, and we prove that it can run a commercial schedule and operate well, and economically, then they're interested in investing in us producing more. So you want to start at the easiest place to demonstrate proof of concept, because you can snowball from there.
Okay. So you mentioned that a big part of this transportation movement is to make it very cost efficient. So if I'm riding an electric minibus versus a gas powered one, what's like the price difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of the assumption is that the fuel savings that the minibus taxi owner operators experience would be passed on to consumers. And that's the assumption because in a competitive marketplace, you learn this in economics, in a competitive marketplace, if one producer of goods, one supplier of goods, um, can lower their costs marginally and undercut other suppliers, then consumers will go to that supplier, right? And so they'll steal all the demand and they'll actually make more of a profit, even though they've cut their price a little bit. But the only reason they can cut their price and still make a profit is because they're operating above their marginal cost. So say you're charging $5 for a service and I'm charging $5 for a service, and it costs both of us $3 to supply the service. We're both making $2 of profit. Suddenly I cut my supply cost to $2 per um, per unit or whatever. So now I'm making I'm making $3 of profit, you're making $2 of profit. So I'm making a little bit more than you. But if I cut down to charging $4.50 per unit, then it's 50 cents cheaper for all of your customers to come to me. So now suddenly I'm losing 50 cents compared to you per unit, but I'm also getting all these other customers. And so basically what happens in a competitive marketplace is this gets driven down. Like suppliers play this game all the way down to the marginal cost or like just above the marginal cost. At least that's, in a purely competitive market. Look, that's like economic theory. In practice, it doesn't happen exactly that way for a lot of reasons, but something like that usually happens if you can provide a much cheaper way to produce supply. And so, providing a much cheaper way to produce supply in our case would be providing electricity as fuel instead of gasoline or petrol or diesel or whatever for the minibus taxis. And so, basically, the assumption is that um, by reducing these fuel costs, the minibus taxi owner operators will pass on the savings to the consumers. And then your question is by how much? Well, that's a good question. It costs, how much does it cost? Let's see if I have these numbers off the top of my head. So it would cost probably about four to five rand. So rand is the South African currency. 4 to 5 rand per kilowatt hour of charging. Okay. And I'll do the conversion to US dollars in a minute. I'm just going to work through these numbers out loud, which is always a never, you
Yeah.
should never do that. You should never do that, but I'm going to do it right now. So say you had an 80 kilowatt hour battery, which is like a very reasonable size for a minibus taxi, and it costed you. So technically, the charger infrastructure people were working with, they charge 5 rand 88, but you could get away with four definitely. So let's say 4 times 80. So 4 rand per kilowatt hour times 80 kilowatt hours is 320 rand. Is that is that about right? Somebody with a calculator can confirm that.
Yeah.
So let's say 320 rand to fill up your tank. And it's 20 rand. I know it's 20 rand to a pound. So I'm working in the UK right now. And I know it's 20, I know it's almost exactly, or it was almost exactly 20 rand to a pound when I was in South Africa like a month ago, and it was pretty much on the dot 20 rand to a pound. So we'll work with that, although it might have changed a little bit, the exchange rate. So if that's 20 rand to a pound, then that's 5, 10, 15, 16 pounds, which is like $18 right now. I think the conversion rate is like 1.15. So maybe like we'll call it like about $18 to fill up your tank of gas for a minibus taxi. Okay. And now that's pretty cheap, right? If you're thinking about like a 16-seater minibus taxi, like $18 to fill up. And then so I was actually riding in a minibus taxi earlier today because I was on my way back. So I row for the university rowing team. For Oxford, we compete in the boat race, and so we train in these like kind of far away, and we ride these minibus taxis, which are basically 16-seater minibus taxis, which is kind of cool for me to do because I do my research on them. And we were just at the petrol station. It costed 90 pounds to fill up 5/8 of the tank. So I'm not going to do
Wow.
that math to fill up to know how much the entire tank would have cost, but so it's over 100 pounds basically to fill up
Yeah.
the whole tank. So honestly, we can even just, and so that's well over $100 then. So even if you called it $100, which seems conservative, because also petrol tends to be quite expensive in South Africa because it's imported. Look, that's like that's 9 times as cheap or whatever, 8 or 9 times as cheap um, already, like roughly. So you can just tell, you can see how much cheaper it is. And so if you say that the savings are passed on to the consumer, and look, again, that's another sort of an assumption, but even if you say half of the savings are passed on to the consumer, that's already 5 times cheaper.
Wow.
That's
Yeah,
crazy.
that is quite the difference in price. So I know going electric causes it obviously has its benefits, but what are kind of the negatives of going electric with the battery usage and all the resources that it takes to make batteries?
That is a fantastic question. So there is the materials concern, right? With lots of batteries, there are these rare earth minerals that are mined that are sort of mined in questionable ways, and there's also a limited amount of them. Um, so the technology we're looking into for our battery is lithium iron phosphate, which is a bit of a donkey of a battery. It's quite safe to use and has a good lifespan, but it's not as sort of high energy as just like a lithium ion battery, which is more commonly seen, I think. But I think lithium iron phosphate is getting more common, but I'm not a battery expert, so I'm not sure about that in particular. But basically, you can use battery chemistries that have less of these rare earth minerals that are cheaper, or sorry, less of these rare earth minerals that are expensive and mined in, like for example, cobalt is like extractively mined in the Congo, and there are lots of human rights questions about that. So Yeah, I mean, I think you can that is a negative, potentially, but you can sort of get away from that a little bit by using different battery chemistries, which is what our solutions are looking into. There's also the negatives on the operational side of range anxiety is a huge issue um, for potential drivers of electric vehicles. In fact, I think there were a couple of surveys done in South Africa and in Rwanda for potential electric vehicle drivers or electric paratransit drivers. So they took paratransit drivers who currently operate and said, okay, like what do you think about going electric? Like, say it was cheaper, blah blah blah. And the two main concerns were one of them was range anxiety, and the other one, I'm blanking on the other one. I think it was availability of charging actually. And those are very related because if there are no chargers available, like how are you going to travel a certain distance, right? Like if I run a route between point A and point B and there's no charger there, then how am I going to do that? Or like if between point A and point B is 250 kilometers and I'm running a long distance route and my battery only takes me 200 kilometers. Sorry, I'm using kilometers because that's the rest of the world uses a
Yeah,
metric system.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
So
it's
fine.
fine.
bear with me. You get the idea. Um,
Yes.
and then, okay, how am I going to get there? I just can't get all the way there. And then also, generally, electric vehicles tend to have a little less range on one charge rather than like one full tank. Um, so that sort of, and then it takes longer to charge. So it can take up to several hours with slow charging. So if you have a seven, so bear with me for a second because these might be a little bit unfamiliar concepts with you. But say I have seven is often used, but let's use five because it's a round number. Say it's a 5 kilowatt AC charger. Okay, that just means that um, it provides 5 kilowatts of power. Okay, to the vehicle that it's charging. So over an hour, that would be 5 kilowatt hours if I was plugged into a 5 kilowatt charger. Now, if I have an 80 kilowatt hour battery, that's going to take a while. That's going to take 80 divided by 5 hours to charge, which I don't know. That's some amount, 16 hours, right? To charge
Yeah, something like
for
that.
a full battery. And so five is a little bit low. Usually, like you can get AC chargers up to maybe like 20, but still, if it was 20, that's still 4 hours to charge a full battery, right? And so there's 50 kilowatt hour deep fast charging and 100 kilowatt charging. Sorry, kilowatt, not kilowatt hour. Um, but that gets more and more expensive, the faster charging. Okay. Um, and still, even if you cut it down to 20 minutes, that's a lot longer than it is to fuel up at a petrol station. And again, there's the question of the availability. So the biggest negative, I think, is this range anxiety, which is very justified in that, especially in something like paratransit, which is incredibly competitive, and you have all these minibus taxis running around just trying to scoop up passengers, get from point A to point B. Like you don't want to be like in the middle of rush hour, you don't want to be like stopping to charge or refuel. You just especially because there are these periods of the day, so the morning rush hour and the afternoon rush hour, like get to work and come home from work, where like you're go go go, you just want to be operating, and then okay, in the middle of the day you can stop, take a break, but you want to be able to get through that period, maybe call it 5 to 9 a.m. You want to be able to get through that period of 5 to 9 a.m. and maybe sort of 4 p.m. to 7 or 8 p.m. of the afternoon rush hour. You want to be able to get through those without having to stop to refuel, because or else you'll lose out on a lot of profits just because that's how the workday is split up. So that's probably the main negative. Trying to think of other ones, but I think that's sort of the main one, as well as yeah, there's this potential issue of if an electric vehicle breaks down in one of these developing contexts and there's no skilled labor around, then how do you fix it, sort of thing. Even though it can be very simple. In fact, it's usually way simpler than an internal combustion engine vehicle because there's only really one moving part in an electric vehicle, and that's the motor, whereas there's hundreds of moving parts in an internal combustion vehicle. But you still have to learn how to do it. There just isn't that skilled labor force yet.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting looking just kind of obviously there are negatives, but the positives just make this an obvious choice of to try and help diminish carbon emissions. All right, we're at 35 minutes, so we might just wrap up. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, it sounds like you're doing great work.